this is the second video for B3 genetics. If you haven't watched the previous video about meiosis and DNA, give that a watch first. We're going to start looking at alleles. So these are two chromosomes, and chromosomes come in pairs. So we have 23 pairs in our diploid cells. We've got 46 chromosomes which come in 23 pairs. So why do they come in pairs? Because we get one of the chromosomes from our fathers through the sperm cell and one from our mothers through the egg cell. So we get 50% of our DNAs from our fathers and 50% through our mothers. And on these chromosomes, we have the same genes from our father and mother. So this gene here, this could be for insulin. The next region, that gene could determine your eye colour. And then finally, that last one could determine what blood group you are. So alleles are different versions of the same gene. So if we're looking at the eye colour gene, we know there's different types of eye colour. You could inherit to have blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes. So that eye colour gene is always in the same place, but you can inherit different versions of that gene from your father and mother. And then different versions are called alleles. And blood groups, you could either have blood group A, B, AB or O, and you get them different versions because of the alleles that you inherit off your father and mother. So for example, if you inherited blood group B from your father and blood group A from your mother, you would have the phenotype having blood AB. So to summarise, alleles are different versions of the same gene, and the combination of alleles that you get determines your physical features. As I mentioned in part 1, there are tons of keywords that we need to understand to master this topic. I am going to use lots of keywords in this slide. I'm going to then, after I've finished describing Punnett squares, try and go back and highlight all of the different keywords and their meanings. So Punnett squares are one of the genetic diagrams, and a common question that could be asked are, how can two healthy people have a child with cystic fibrosis? So there are two alleles for cystic fibrosis. There is a healthy one and a diseased one. We're going to use a big F to describe the healthy version and a small f to describe the diseased version of the gene. So if we again look at chromosomes, there will be a region on one of the pairs of chromosomes that determines, do we have cystic fibrosis or do we not? And we could either have the big F allele or the small f allele. And we're going to say that this person here, they inherited the small f allele off their father and the big F off their mother. So this person has the genotype big F little f. So what would their phenotype be? Well, because they have one big healthy allele, they would not have cystic fibrosis. So their physical features for this disease, they will be healthy. They have a healthy phenotype because they have one big healthy copy and one recessive allele which is unhealthy. So dominant and recessive. Dominant, if you have a copy of both of the alleles, if you have one dominant copy, that would overpower the recessive allele. For the recessive phenotype to come out, you would need both copies of a recessive allele. So for cystic fibrosis, you would need to be small f to have cystic fibrosis. This person has big F, little f, so the big F overpowers that recessive diseased allele, meaning that they don't have the disease. So if two people had big F, little f genotypes, what would the probability of them having a child with cystic fibrosis? Well, we can use a Punnett square to work that out. So we'll look at the father first. So if the father has the genotype big F, little f, what are the chances that the sperm cell he makes having the unhealthy allele? Well, that's 50%. So meiosis is random. So 50% of his sperm would have a healthy dominant allele, and half his sperm would have an unhealthy recessive disease allele for this disease, cystic fibrosis. And now if we look at the mother, so the mother again would have 50% chance of her eggs having the healthy allele and 50% chance of her eggs having the unhealthy allele. If we then put them in a grid, we have the 4 different combinations of alleles that these two parents could make. Before we do this, it's important to understand that both of these parents would be considered carriers of the disease. So they are healthy, however there's a probability that their children may not be. So the first combination, so a child could inherit the big dominant healthy allele from their father and also the big dominant healthy allele from their mother. They would have the genotype big F, and they would have the phenotype of being healthy. They wouldn't even be a carrier because they've inherited the dominant non-disease allele from their mother and father. There is no chance of their children having the disease because they are going to inherit one of them copies of the healthy gene from them, so their children could not have cystic fibrosis if they inherited this genotype. This person here has inherited a recessive disease allele from their father, but a healthy one from their mother. So they have the genotype big F, little f. Their phenotype, they would be a carrier. And very similar, the other square, they have inherited the dominant healthy allele from their father, but the recessive one from the mother this time. The genotype would still be the same, and their phenotype, they would also be a carrier. And in the final box, this child has inherited a recessive allele from both their mother and father, and because they don't have that healthy allele, they would have the disease cystic fibrosis. So their phenotype would be that they have cystic fibrosis. The last thing we need to do is look at probability. So there are 4 possible outcomes. There is a 1 in 4 chance, or a 25% chance, of the child being healthy, and that's because only one of the boxes has the genotype big F. The second outcome is a 2 out of the 4, or a 50% chance, of the child being a carrier and having the genotype big F, little f. There is also, sadly, a 1 in 4, or a 25% chance, of the child having that disease. So how can 2 healthy people have a child with cystic fibrosis? This is if they are both carriers and that the child inherits 2 of the unhealthy alleles for a recessive disease. So we're going to recap some of them keywords now. We're going to look at a different Punnett square, which is the probability of a child being a certain gender. So the father's genotype is XY. All males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. They are XY. And the mother would be XX. So half of the sperm cells that the father produces have an X chromosome. Half of them have a Y chromosome. All of the mother's egg cells have an X chromosome. So what is the probability that a child will be male? It will be 50%. So 2 out of 4 would have the genotype XY. So the genotype is what genes you inherit, and that will give rise to the phenotype, the physical features. So if the child had the genotype XX, they would have the phenotype being a female. And to recap, alleles are different versions of the same gene. So for the cystic fibrosis gene, you could have a big F that is dominant, meaning that it is more powerful than a small f allele. So if you had the genotype big F, little f, you would have the phenotype of being healthy because the big F allele is overpowering the small f diseased allele. So genotypes are what genes you have, phenotypes are what physical features you have, and dominant genes overpower recessive genes. So to have a recessive disease, you need 2 copies of that recessive disease allele. So another type of genetic diagram that you need to know about is the family pedigree chart. So pedigrees. And these have a key at the bottom which you need to be able to understand. And it tells you that if it is a square, that person is a male, and if it is a circle, that person's a female. It also tells you that if that is a orange block, then that person does not have the disease. If it is a stripy block, stripy colouring, they do have this disease. It is also telling you that this disease is caused by a recessive allele. So you would need 2 copies of the small allele to have this disease. What I would do now is, can you pause the video and figure out, do you know the answers to these questions already? So what is Brian's genotype? Can you remember what that word genotype means? What is the probability that Sam has this disease? You will need to use a pedigree chart for that. So pause the video now and work that out, please. Okay, so Brian has the disease, so his genotype must be small q, because he is a male with the disease, and because it is a recessive disease, he must have both copies of the recessive small q allele to have that disease. So therefore he must be small q. What is the probability that Sam has PKU? So because there's a line up between Sam and Brian and Carolyn, that means that they are both his parents. So we can use a Punnett square now to work out the probability that Sam has PKU. And that's Brian's genotype there, and Sam's mother's genotype, Carolyn's genotype there. So he has 50% chance of being big Q, small q, and 50% chance having small q. So this means that he would have 50% chance of having the disease and 50% chance of being big Q, small q, so having the phenotype of being a carrier, so not having the disease but carrying it. So to answer the question again, what is the probability that Sam has the disease? It's 50% chance, because he has 50% chance of inheriting the diseased allele from his mother and 100% chance of getting the diseased allele from his father who has the disease. So he is 50-50 whether or not he would have the disease. So this is a long piece of genetic code. So this is a gene, and genes make things happen, so physical features. So we'll say that this gene is the gene for insulin. So if you have a normal copy of this gene, you do not have diabetes, you are healthy. If this is changed in some way, you would have diabetes. So every time a cell splits during mitosis, it has to make identical copies of the DNA. Sometimes, when the DNA is copied, it will make a wrong copy, and this is known as a mutation. So a mutation is just a change in a gene, a change in the genetic code, and this can happen naturally or spontaneously. So as we get older, your hair may turn grey, and that's because the gene that makes your natural hair colour is forgotten, and that's natural. So what will happen is your hair colour will be forgotten and your hair will just become grey, and that is due to a natural mutation. Mutations can also happen because of ionizing radiation or mutagens, which are any chemical that can cause mutations, and these are found in things like cigarette smoke, in alcohol, in certain preservatives that are unnatural, and these can also be produced naturally in the body, but they can then lead to mutations. So during mutations, genes can change, and this can be bad. It can lead to things such as cancer. It could also have no effect. So even though the genetic code is different, it might have no effect on the phenotype. And these mutations could also be good. So for example, when an animal has a mutation which changes the colour of its fur, this could make it more likely to be camouflaged, so it could escape predators more easily. So mutations can be bad, and they are normally bad. So 99% of mutations will be bad. Some will have no effect, but some, very rarely, can actually give that organism more chance of surviving. So the last thing we need to understand is variation. So variation is just the differences between us, and it is caused by either your DNA, the genes that you have, that's called genetic variation, or it can be caused by the environment around you. So for example, how much food you eat or what type of food you eat, the people that you interact with, how much sunlight you get, and this is called environmental variation. If you want to make a list now of variations shown between you and your classmates or family members, things that are different about you, and then try and put them into these categories. So things caused by your genes, things caused by differences in your environment, and then last of all, things caused by both your genes and the environment. See if you can do that now. If you're happy, we can move on and I will tell you 3 examples of each of these. So differences in your DNA can cause your eye colour or your natural hair colour to be different. It can cause your earlobes to be attached or detached. So one gene controls that and you can have one or the other. If you don't know what that means, if you Google it. And then the last reason how we can be different from each other due to changes in our genes is, do we have genetic diseases? So for example, some people have cystic fibrosis, most people do not. Some people have type 1 diabetes, and these are caused by changes in your genes. Things that are caused by changes in your environment are things such as the language you speak or what accent you have. So if you're brought up in Jarrow, you speak English with a certain accent. If you're from London, you also speak English with a different accent. If you are brought up in Spain, you would speak Spanish. And that is due to the things outside of your body that is having an impact on you. So your environment causes difference in language. It can also cause things such as scars or tattoos. And finally, your haircut or your hairstyle. That is caused by things outside of the body. It's not caused by your genes at all. So the haircut you have is caused by the environment. Lots of other things are caused by both your genes and your environment working together. So for example, your height. If you have 2 very, very tall parents, but you are in an environment where you do not get a lot of food, you're not going to be tall. So height is caused by both your genes and your environment, and so is your weight or your mass in kilograms. If you have 2 very, very skinny parents, but you are in an environment where you eat lots of burgers and fatty foods and energy drinks, you are going to be overweight. And another example is intelligence. So you could have 2 parents who are rocket scientists, and their child could be locked in a room which just has 4 walls and no other stimulation, no books or anything. So they would not be intelligent if they were brought up in that environment. So if you have parents that have certain characteristics, you are more likely to have them characteristics. But your environment also has an impact on your physical features. So these are the causes of variation. Now we're going to look at the types of variation. So there's 2 different types that everybody needs to know about: continuous and discontinuous. Continuous variation is where you can be anywhere in a range of values. So you could be 178 centimeters, you could be 179, but you could also be in between that. And continuous variation, you could plot this data on a scatter plot, so you could be anywhere on an x-axis or a y-axis, because you could be any value on that graph. Discontinuous variation, however, this is where you fall into one set category. So for example, your blood type, you can fit into one of 4 categories. You can't be anywhere in between them categories. So here we would have to draw a bar chart with individual groups. So you couldn't do a scatter plot for discontinuous variation, but you can for continuous variation. So there's 5 more here. If you want to try and pause the video and put these into either continuous or discontinuous categories, you can do that now. So continuous variation are things that can be measured in centimeters or in grams or have some sort of rate, whereas discontinuous variation, these fall into one or a number of categories. And a little bit of further information: discontinuous variation is caused by your DNA, what you inherit. Not always, but quite often. Continuous variation, however, is caused by a mixture of both your genes and the environment around you. So last thing we need to know is normal distribution. And normal distribution is caused in variation where things are gathered around a mean. So we'll look at height first. The most common height in UK males is 5'9". So this height has the highest frequency. And as you get away from the mean, this becomes less frequent. So some males are 7'2" in the UK, but this is much less frequent. So normal distribution is where the mean is the most common value, and as you move further away from that mean value, it becomes less common. And this type of graph with frequency on is called a histogram. And normal distribution causes a bell-shaped curve, where the top of the bell would be the mean, the most common value, and all of the things that have continuous variation follow this pattern. So in humans, other types of variation that would show this sort of distribution, normal distribution, will be things like weight, intelligence, blood pressure, and other things. So thanks for watching. If you are a foundation level student, please try some questions now. If you're doing either the higher or the triple course, you have additional videos to watch.